Carter Miller only wanted to pick up his daughter in his beat-up, rust-covered car, but in front of the glass tower of Bennett Apex, he was humiliated by CEO Charlotte Bennett. When she coldly ordered her guards to smash what she called his rolling piece of junk, everyone expected Carter to fall to his knees and beg. But the steel hammer that swung down against the window bounced back with a jarring crack, sending the guards sprawling to the ground. Charlotte went still as she realized the glass was anything but ordinary. And Carter, the poor father, raised his head. Stay until the end, because that rusted car is hiding a secret that will force the CEO to pay dearly. The engine of Carter Miller's car announced its arrival before the vehicle ever turned the corner. It was a low, ragged growl, the kind of sound that made heads turn not out of admiration but out of something closer to concern, as though the machine might simply stop moving at any moment. The body was a faded silver gray, the original color buried under years of oxidation, the panels streaked with rust that had bled from the wheel wells up toward the door frames. The windshield was filmed with a fine layer of road dust that the wipers had long since given up fighting. Carter drove it the same way every afternoon, one hand loose on the wheel, eyes calm, posture unhurried, as if the car and the man had come to an understanding that neither needed to impress anyone. He pulled into the drop-off lane at Bennett Academy and let the engine idle, and every parent who glanced over from their polished sedans and imported SUVs looked away just a little too quickly. Bennett Academy was the kind of school that had a separate lane for luxury vehicles. The maple trees lining the entrance had been planted in perfect intervals, and the iron gates bore the school crest in gold leaf. Parents who waited here dressed as though picking up their children was itself a social occasion. Carter wore a gray work shirt with an oil smear near the right pocket that he hadn't noticed when he left the garage. He sat quietly while the other vehicles idled in climate-controlled comfort, and he watched the front entrance with the particular patience of a man who had learned, through long experience, that waiting was simply part of the work. Ella came out in her school uniform, navy blue blazer over a white blouse, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She spotted her father's car immediately. It was hard to miss, and her pace slowed by just a half step before she recovered and walked the rest of the way normally. Carter noticed. He always noticed the things Ella tried to hide from him, because she hid them the same way her mother once had, with a small adjustment of expression that she probably didn't know she was making. She climbed in, set her bag at her feet, and said she had a good day, and Carter said that was good, and they pulled forward toward the exit. That was when Charlotte Bennett's motorcade arrived. Two black vehicles turned into the entrance ahead of them, slowing everyone in the lane to a stop. Charlotte stepped out of the second car in a charcoal blazer and heeled shoes, flanked by an assistant and a man in a dark jacket who scanned the area with practiced efficiency. She was attending a donor briefing, one of several she held each term at the various schools her company had absorbed over the past decade. Bennett Academy was, technically, her property, and she moved through it with the ease of someone who had long since stopped distinguishing between places she owned and places she simply entered. Her eyes landed on Carter's car the way eyes land on something that does not belong. She paused mid-stride, said something to her assistant, and the assistant pointed at the vehicle and spoke briefly into an earpiece. A security officer in a school blazer was already approaching Carter's window before Charlotte reached the front steps. The officer told Carter he would need to move the vehicle to the overflow lot on the far side of the building, that the lane was reserved for guests attending the donor event. Carter said he was there to pick up his daughter, that his daughter was in the car, and that he would be leaving in just a moment. The officer looked uncertain. Charlotte, who had paused just far enough away to listen, stepped closer. She said the car was an eyesore. She said it loud enough that two other parents nearby could hear, and she said it without looking directly at Carter, in the way that powerful people sometimes deliver insults as observations rather than attacks, as though they are simply describing the world accurately. Carter kept his hands on the steering wheel. Ella stared forward. Charlotte told her security officer to have the vehicle removed if it wasn't gone within 5 minutes, then turned back toward the building without waiting for a reply. As she walked away, she said one more thing, almost to herself but clearly intended to Carrie, that if she ever saw that rolling piece of scrap metal near any Bennett Apex property again, she would have it towed and crushed, and the driver could sort out the paperwork afterward. Carter watched her go. He put the car in drive. He said nothing, but something behind his eyes went very quiet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, printed on heavy cream paper with the Bennett Academy crest embossed at the top. Ella read it twice at the kitchen table while Carter made coffee, then slid it across to him without saying anything. The Regional Student Innovation Competition had selected her as a finalist. Her project, a child passenger safety monitoring system designed to detect improper restraint positions and alert drivers in real time, had been chosen out of more than 300 submissions from across the district. The finalist presentations would be held at the headquarters of Bennett Apex, in the main event atrium on the 14th floor. A parent or guardian was strongly encouraged to accompany each finalist. Carter read the letter, set it down, and poured his coffee. Ella watched him. She had spent 2 months on that project, refining the sensor array in her bedroom with a soldering iron she had bought secondhand and a set of microcontrollers she had ordered online with money saved from tutoring younger students. She knew what the letter meant in terms of the work. She also knew what it meant in terms of where they would have to go. She did not say anything about that, but she turned her coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, and Carter understood. He went to the garage that evening after dinner. It was a narrow space behind the house, barely wide enough for the car and a work table along one wall. He pulled on a work light and moved through a routine long since made automatic, checking the door seals, running his fingertips along the edge of each window frame, pressing at the base of the B-pillar to confirm no flex. He opened the hood and checked the engine bay the same way a mechanic would, but then reached further back, behind the firewall, and verified the integrity of something mounted there that no standard vehicle had any reason to carry. He checked the undercarriage with a mirror on a telescoping rod, moving along the frame rails in a careful grid. Then he opened the driver's door and reached beneath the front seat, confirming the position of a flat metal panel that sat flush against the floor with no visible handle. On the drive to Bennett Apex the following Saturday, Ella sat in the passenger seat with her presentation materials in her lap. The city moved past the windows in gray and chrome. She asked her father why he had never bought a different car, something newer, something that did not sound like it was renegotiating with gravity every time they went uphill. Carter thought for a moment before answering. He said the car had done things that newer cars had not. He said it had kept people safe in situations where most vehicles would have failed. Ella asked him what kind of situations, and he said the serious kind, and when she asked him to be more specific he just smiled and turned on the radio. The headquarters of Bennett Apex occupied a full city block, a tower of blue-tinted glass rising 42 stories above a paved plaza that had been landscaped with imported stone and a pair of reflecting pools. The visitors' parking area was arranged in a visible hierarchy, with the closest spaces occupied by vehicles that collectively represented more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. A burgundy sports coupe sat nearest the entrance. A long black executive sedan with tinted glass occupied the space beside it. Carter drove his car into the lane and found an open space without incident, until the parking attendant stepped in front of them with one arm raised. The attendant was young, efficient, and visibly uncomfortable. He said the space was reserved. Carter showed him Ella's invitation letter, the one on cream paper with the embossed crest. The attendant checked a clipboard, found Ella's name, and stepped aside with a small nod that managed to be simultaneously professional and reluctant. As they walked toward the entrance, Carter heard another car behind them and turned. Charlotte Bennett's vehicle was pulling in 3 spaces over. She stepped out and looked across the lot, and when her gaze landed on the rusted car in the reserved guest area, her expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the specific way of someone who has issued a warning and now finds it politely ignored. The atrium on the 14th floor had been arranged for the occasion with the careful deliberateness of people who believed presentation and substance were the same thing. Round tables dressed in white linen occupied the outer ring of the space, and a low stage had been set along the far wall with a projection screen and a podium trimmed in brushed aluminum. The finalist students stood in a cluster near a registration table, most of them with a parent close by, and the ambient sound was the quiet mixture of professional small talk and the particular nervous energy of young people who had worked very hard and were about to find out if it was enough. Ella found her numbered table and began arranging her display, and Carter stood a few feet behind her with his hands in his pockets, watching her settle into the work with the focused calm that had always been her most reliable trait. Charlotte arrived on the atrium floor 20 minutes after the event began. She moved through the space with Mason Reed half a step behind her and 2 other members of her security team fanning out on either side. She greeted the school director with a handshake and a comment about the turnout, then moved along the table line at the pace of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than participating in it. When she reached the section of the room where Carter stood, she stopped. She took him in: the gray work shirt, the worn boots, the posture that was neither aggressive nor diminished, and then she looked at Ella's display table with an expression that sharpened slightly, as though the presence of both of them in this space was a specific kind of affront. She spoke first, quietly enough that the words were meant only for Carter and the people immediately around him. She asked what he was doing here. Carter said his daughter was one of the finalists, and that he was her accompanying guardian, as the letter had specified. Charlotte said she recalled mentioning something to him about the limits of where his vehicle was welcome. Carter said he recalled that too, and that he had parked in the guest area assigned by the parking attendant, who had confirmed Ella's credentials. Charlotte looked at him for a moment with the particular calculation of someone deciding how far to press a point in a semi-public setting. She pressed it. She said, not quietly this time, that she found it remarkable how some people mistook access to an event for actual belonging, and that the competition was designed to identify talented young people, not to provide their parents with an occasion to occupy areas above their station. A few heads at nearby tables turned. One woman covered a small smile. Ella had gone very still at her display materials, her eyes fixed on the arrangement of components she had spent 2 months building, her hands not moving. Carter did not raise his voice. He said he was there to support his daughter, and he asked Charlotte to conduct whatever business she had outside, rather than in front of the students. That was the wrong thing to say. Not because it was unreasonable, but because Charlotte was not a person who responded well to having the terms of a confrontation set by someone else. She told Mason to escort Carter to the lobby. Mason stepped forward, and Carter turned to look at him, not threateningly, not with any shift in posture, just a direct look, and something in Mason's forward movement faltered by the smallest fraction. Carter had eyes that had seen things that could not be described in polite company, and Mason Reed, who had spent years in close protection work developing an instinct for danger, felt that instinct fire on a frequency he had not used in a long time. He completed his step but stopped short of touching Carter. Carter looked at Ella, who was looking back at him. He told her to focus on her presentation, that she had worked too hard for anything in this room to matter more than the work itself. Then he walked toward the elevator without being asked. Charlotte followed him, because the particular pride of powerful people does not allow the last word to belong to someone who just voluntarily walked away. In the lobby, and then through the lobby and out into the open air of the parking plaza, she continued at his shoulder with Mason and one other guard behind her. When they reached the guest area and Carter stopped at his car, Charlotte walked to the center of the lane, turned to face the small audience of parking attendants and passing employees and curious onlookers who had gathered, and she pointed at the rusted car. She announced, clearly and without hesitation, that she was going to demonstrate what happened when someone repeatedly ignored the standards of a Bennett Apex property. She said Carter Miller had been warned. She said he had chosen to ignore that warning. She said that the vehicle he had parked on her property was going to be removed, right now, by whatever means were most efficient. Charlotte turned to Mason and told him to get the equipment from the security bay. Mason stood very still for a moment. He said, keeping his voice low, that there could be liability concerns with damaging a private vehicle. Charlotte said she was not asking for a legal opinion. She said if Mason was not able to execute a simple instruction without a discussion, she had a list of candidates who could take his position by the end of the week. Mason looked at Carter, who was standing with his back against the car, arms loosely at his sides, watching the whole thing with the detached attention of someone observing an event they have been expecting for a long time. Mason turned and walked toward the security bay. 2 of the other guards produced crowbars from a locked cabinet near the entrance. A third came back from the equipment room pushing a flat cart with a sledgehammer resting across it. The small crowd had grown: employees on lunch break, a few event guests who had followed down from the atrium, 2 parking attendants standing near a concrete pillar with the expressions of people who wanted very much to be somewhere else. Nearly everyone who had a phone had it out. Ella had come down in the elevator and was standing near the glass doors of the lobby entrance, and when she saw the sledgehammer, she walked quickly toward her father. Carter met her before she reached the car. He put both hands on her shoulders, looked at her directly, and said two things: that she needed to stay behind him, and that she needed to trust him. Ella started to say something and he shook his head once, gently, in the way that meant the discussion would happen later and now was not the time. She stepped back. Carter turned around and placed himself between the crowd and the car. Charlotte had moved to the edge of the lane, positioned at an angle that put her slightly above the action on a raised curb, the way that people who arrange confrontations position themselves when they want to observe rather than be touched by what happens. She looked at Carter with the flat satisfaction of someone who has made a decision and is watching it be executed. She said he had had several chances to avoid this. She said she hoped it was instructive. The guard with the sledgehammer stepped forward. He was a large man, accustomed to things yielding when he applied force to them. He raised the hammer with the practiced ease of someone who had done demolition work and swung it at the driver's side window. The sound it made was wrong. Not the explosive crack and scatter of breaking safety glass, but a dense, flat clang, like metal striking something that simply refused to participate. The hammer rebounded off the window with enough force that the guard's wrist snapped back violently, and he stumbled sideways and dropped to one knee, grabbing at his right hand. He made a sharp sound through his teeth. The sledgehammer lay on the pavement. The window had a faint white mark where the hammerhead had contacted it, a surface score no deeper than a fingernail scratch. The crowd went quiet all at once, in the particular way that crowds go quiet when something they were all certain about turns out to be incorrect. Charlotte stared at the window. She said nothing for a moment, then told the other guards to use the crowbars. Both men stepped forward and applied the flat ends of the bars to the window frame and the door seam, working at different points, and the results were the same. The tools made no impression. The door seam did not flex. The window did not deflect inward. One of the guards shifted his grip and struck the rear quarter panel with the side of his bar, and the panel produced a sound that was far denser than sheet steel had any right to be. Mason had come back from the equipment bay and was standing apart from the other guards. He was looking at the car the way a trained professional looks at something that has just demonstrated a capability that should not exist in the category it was assigned to. He walked to the window and bent close, examining the scored mark without touching it. The scratch on the surface was shallow, but what stopped him was the cross-section visible at the scratch edge, not one layer of glass, not even two, but a laminated stack of materials that included at least one layer with a slightly greenish tint. He had seen that tint before, in a different context. Years ago, during a contractor orientation for a government protection detail. He stood up and said, quietly, that everyone needed to stop. Charlotte told him to stay out of it. Mason said that with respect, what had just happened was not a failed equipment demonstration, it was a demonstration of something else entirely, and continuing was going to create a problem that was significantly larger than a parking dispute. Carter stepped forward then. His voice, when he spoke, was lower than it had been at any point in the afternoon, and it carried the specific quality of someone who has decided that the patience portion of the interaction is finished. He said that Charlotte had just attempted to destroy a vehicle carrying a security classification that her company's legal team would find very interesting to learn about. He said that the exterior cameras of the vehicle had been recording since the moment the guards approached with equipment. He said that the building's own external camera array had been recording since before that. He turned to look at the crowd still holding up their phones and said that he imagined several private recordings existed as well. Then he looked back at Charlotte. She was not smiling anymore. Mason asked the question that several people in the crowd were already trying to formulate. He asked Carter what the car actually was. Not in an aggressive way, the aggression had left Mason some minutes earlier, but in the cautious, careful way of someone who suspects the answer is going to require a significant revision of several assumptions. Carter looked at him for a moment, then reached into his pocket and took out a key fob. It was a standard-looking piece of black plastic. Unremarkable, but when he pressed the center button, what came from the car was not the chirp and flash of a consumer vehicle's alarm system. It was a single low tone, clean and precise, and then the sound of 4 electronic deadbolts releasing in sequence, each with a different mechanical note, the whole thing over in less than 2 seconds. He opened the driver's door. The interior was not what anyone expected. The factory cabin had been replaced with a purpose-built environment. The seat structure was wrapped in a lightweight alloy frame bolted directly to the vehicle's reinforced floor pan. The door panel on the inside was not plastic cladding but a composite material that was matte gray and slightly textured, with a recessed handle that retracted flush when not in use. The center console housed a row of toggle switches under a hinged protective cover, and a flat panel display the size of a thin paperback was mounted just below the standard gauge cluster. Along the interior of the rear doors, visible only because Carter left them open, a series of port covers ran in a horizontal line at window height. He said, simply, that the car had been built as a protection vehicle. He said it had been designed to operate in environments where standard vehicles did not provide adequate occupant safety, and that the exterior had been left in its current condition because a vehicle that draws no attention provides protection that no amount of armor can fully replicate. He said the glass was multi-layer ballistic laminate, the body panels were composite armored over a steel substrate, the tires were run flat, and the fuel system had been modified to prevent ignition from impact. He said a vehicle like this, properly built, could take a direct strike from standard anti-personnel munitions and continue to operate. He said the one he was standing next to was one of 4 prototypes he had personally engineered, and the only one still in private hands. The crowd had stopped moving entirely. Charlotte was still on the raised curb, but her posture had changed. She was no longer leaning forward. She had shifted her weight back, the way people do when the ground they are standing on turns out to be different from what they assumed. Mason said the name. He said it quietly, to himself as much as to Carter, working through a recollection that had surfaced slowly and then all at once. Carter Miller. He had heard that name from a contractor who had worked a State Department detail years ago, in a context involving a vehicle convoy ambushed on a secondary highway that should have had no survivors, except that the lead vehicle had held, and the people inside it had walked out, and the name of the man who had designed that vehicle had been passed around afterward in the way that names are passed around when people are trying to understand how something impossible was actually accomplished. Carter did not confirm or deny it. He looked at his daughter, who was standing 10 feet away with an expression he had seen before, only on the face of someone who has been given information that reorganizes everything they thought they understood. He told Ella that he would explain everything when they got home. She said she thought he fixed cars. He said he did. She said that was not what she meant, and he said he knew. Charlotte said that Carter's technical history, whatever it was, did not change the fact that he had parked an unusual vehicle on her property without disclosure. Carter said she was welcome to consult the event invitation, which specified the guest lot and the parking attendant who had verified Ella's credentials. He said the vehicle's presence was legal, documented, and fully within the terms of the event. He said the events of the last 15 minutes, by contrast, represented multiple instances of intentional property damage attempted against a vehicle carrying a verified security classification, and that the recordings made by both the vehicle's external cameras and the people in the crowd would make that very clear to anyone who reviewed them. That was when the car spoke. Not in any dramatic sense, it was simply that one of the systems Carter had referenced made a sound. A short, repeating tone, low and steady, coming from somewhere beneath the dashboard. Carter's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough that Mason noticed, because Mason had spent years learning to read the faces of people who were processing threat information in real time. Carter crouched beside the driver's door, reached under the sill, and tapped a small screen mounted flush with the door frame. He looked at the readout. He stood. He looked at the ground beneath the car. He looked at Charlotte. He said they needed to move everyone away from the vehicle immediately, and his voice carried exactly the tone of someone who is not performing urgency but experiencing it. Charlotte started to say something dismissive. She had the expression of a person who suspects they are being managed, who has been on the receiving end of dramatic performances often enough to develop a reflex against being moved by them. Mason was faster. He had heard that tone before, not from Carter specifically, but from men who worked in the same operational register, men who did not manufacture emergencies for effect, and he stepped forward and put one hand on Charlotte's arm and said, firmly, that they were going to move. Charlotte looked at his hand on her arm and then at his face, and something in his expression convinced her that the discussion she was about to start would need to happen somewhere else. The crowd moved. Mason directed the parking attendants and the guests toward the main lobby entrance, keeping his body between the flow of people and the car while Carter worked the doorframe screen with the focus speed of someone running a diagnostic they have run many times before, just not under these conditions. Ella stayed close to her father. Carter told her to go with Mason and she said no. And he looked at her once and then turned back to the screen, which meant he had accepted the answer and moved on. The device was attached to the right rear suspension arm, close to the differential housing, in the kind of position that a person who understood vehicle undercarriage architecture would know was largely invisible during a casual inspection. It was roughly the size and shape of a deck of playing cards. The antenna wire had been threaded along the existing wiring harness in a way that showed careful preparation, not improvisation. Carter identified it without touching it, photographed it with the doorframe camera, and then checked the signal data the vehicle's monitoring system had logged. The transmitter had been active for approximately 4 hours. It had been pinged by an external receiver once, 40 minutes ago, and a second time 12 minutes ago, when the crowd had assembled in the parking area. He said, loud enough for Mason to hear from the edge of the cleared zone, that the device was live and had been queried twice in the last hour. Mason turned. He came back to Carter's position, crouched beside him, and looked at the device without being asked. He said the placement was professional. Carter agreed. He said the timing of the second ping, when the largest concentration of people was in the parking area, was consistent with target confirmation before activation. Mason said he understood, then called his radio and told his team that the east parking area needed to be evacuated immediately and that they needed the building security director on the line. A sound came from the direction of the side gate, one of the secondary vehicle entrances on the building's east face. It was a contained detonation, not a large one, sized more like a commercial-grade signal charge than a device intended to destroy structural material, but sharp and immediate, and it blew the gate off its mounting posts and sent a concussion wave across the lot that knocked a parking attendant off his feet and cracked 3 ground-floor windows. The crowd that had already moved toward the lobby doors surged. Charlotte pressed back against the wall of the building with both hands flat on the glass. Ella was on the ground between 2 parked cars, hands over her head, unhurt. Carter had moved before the detonation completed. He was beside his car, door open, using the vehicle as a barrier between the blast direction and the cluster of students who had come down from the atrium and had not yet made it to the lobby. He held that position until he could confirm the area was clear, then conducted a fast visual sweep of the lot, reading it the way a person reads a room they have been trained to read. He said to Mason, who had rejoined him, that the charge at the gate was not the primary objective. The placement, the timing, the size, none of it was consistent with an attack aimed at causing maximum casualties. It was consistent with causing a controlled panic at a publicized event tied to a publicly traded company, at a moment when that company's leadership was visibly present and visibly behaving in a way that was already being recorded. Someone had needed the event to become a disaster, damaging enough to affect confidence but contained enough to be survivable. He said whoever had placed the device under his car had not been trying to kill him. They had been using him as a delivery mechanism. Mason said it out loud. The target was Charlotte. Carter said yes. Mason asked who would gain from a public security failure at a Bennett Apex event, one that occurred while Charlotte was on camera giving orders that would not survive a legal review. Carter said he had some thoughts about that, but he wanted to see the device pulled and examined before he said them. The federal security contractors arrived within 40 minutes, followed shortly by local police and a pair of lawyers representing the Bennett Apex Board of Directors. The lawyers had been called by the board, not by Charlotte, which was its own kind of information. The exterior of the building was cordoned off, the event was formally suspended, and the remaining students and their families were directed to a ground-floor conference room where a building coordinator was doing a competent job of projecting calm while internally conducting a very detailed review of his career choices. The footage from Carter's vehicle cameras had been transmitted automatically to a secure server the moment Carter had activated the monitoring alert. The footage from the building's external camera array had been sequenced by the security director and was already being reviewed by investigators. The private recordings made by the crowd would take longer to aggregate, but the building's attorney, reviewing a preliminary selection in a side office, said something quietly to a colleague that made both of them stop speaking for several seconds. Charlotte was in a conference room on the third floor, alone except for one of her board lawyers and a representative from the federal contractor team. The lawyer was doing most of the talking. Charlotte was not. She was looking at the conference table in the way that people look at things when they are not seeing what is in front of them, but are instead running through a sequence of events and identifying each moment where a different decision would have led somewhere better. Ella's project was formally recognized by the 2 remaining judges who had stayed on site. Her child safety monitoring system received a distinguished merit commendation, 1 level below first place, which had not been awarded due to the event's suspension, and the competition director told Carter, in the corridor, that Ella's work was the most technically rigorous submission he had reviewed in 11 years of running the program. Carter said he would tell her. He did, in the lobby, and Ella said she wanted to go home, and he said that was fair. Mason found Carter near the lobby exit at the end of the evening. He stood in front of him for a moment without speaking, in the way that people stand when they have something specific to say and are deciding whether the words are going to be adequate. Then he said he owed Carter an apology. He said he had allowed Charlotte's instructions to override his own professional judgment and his own reading of the situation, and that if Carter had not been who he was, if that car had been what it looked like rather than what it was, the outcome of the afternoon could have been much worse for everyone present. Carter said he understood the position Mason had been in. Mason said understanding was not the same as the other thing, and Carter said no, it was not, and they let that stand as sufficient. Charlotte asked to speak with Carter before he left. Mason arranged it, a brief meeting in one of the ground floor rooms that the building staff had kept separate from the investigation activity. Charlotte came in without her assistant, which was unusual enough that Carter noticed it. She sat across the table from him and was quiet for a moment, and then asked why he had not used any of what he knew earlier. She said he had clearly understood, from the beginning of the afternoon, that there were options available to him that most people would not have had. She asked why he had chosen not to use them. Carter thought about the question seriously, which she appeared to appreciate. She seemed like someone who did not receive many serious answers. He said he had not come to the building to prove anything. He said he had come because his daughter had been invited, and he had wanted to watch her present the work she had spent 2 months building. He said the rest of it had been imposed on him, and that he had made the decisions that the situation required, but that winning a confrontation had not been his goal for the afternoon. Charlotte was quiet again. He said one other thing, that the kind of power she had been using all afternoon was not the kind that made a person safe. It was the kind that made them a target. She said she was beginning to understand that. He said he hoped so, because the person who had arranged the afternoon's more serious events was still operating, and they had chosen her specifically because they believed she would make their work easier. It was not a compliment. Charlotte's jaw tightened slightly. She said she understood. He told Ella that evening. They sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the same table where Ella had slid the competition letter across to him 3 weeks earlier, and Carter told his daughter the things he had been keeping behind a wall of normalcy for most of her life. He did it the way he did difficult things, methodically, without excessive ornamentation, starting from the beginning and moving forward. He told her he had worked as a vehicle protection engineer for nearly 15 years. He had begun in a private sector role, designing armored transport systems for executive protection firms, and had later taken on contracts with federal agencies that required a more substantial level of discretion. His work had taken him to places that did not appear in any documentation he was at liberty to share with anyone, and the vehicles he had designed had been used in environments where the cost of a failure was measured in human lives rather than dollars. He told her he was good at it. He said it plainly, without pride, the way a craftsman describes their work. He told her about her mother. He said that Rachel had understood the nature of what he did, had always understood it, and had never asked him to stop because she believed in the value of the work. She had died on a Tuesday in the autumn, in a country that Carter still did not name, during a mission where the vehicle that had failed had not been one he built. He had been in the follow car. He had arrived at the scene in time to understand what had happened, and too late to prevent it. He stopped speaking for a moment. Ella did not say anything. He told her he had kept the prototype because it was the last vehicle his hands had built while Rachel was still alive. He said it was not a sentimental object in the usual sense, but it was a record of a particular kind of work, and discarding it had felt like a wrong kind of ending. He said the rust was deliberate. He had applied it himself, using a process that accelerated oxidation on the outer surface while leaving the structural components untouched, because a vehicle that looked like a liability attracted no professional attention. He said he had been watched before and he preferred not to be watched now. Ella asked him why he had never told her. Not with anger, or with the hurt that comes from feeling deceived, but with genuine curiosity, in the way she approached most problems. Carter said he had wanted her life to be uncomplicated. He said the world she had grown up in, school, dinner at 7, science projects on the kitchen table, was a world he had built with some deliberateness, and that the other world was still there, had always been there, but he had preferred to keep the two things separate. He said he was not certain, in retrospect, whether that had been the right decision. She said she did not think it had been wrong. Charlotte received a report from the federal investigators the following afternoon that included a dossier on Carter compiled from contractor records and a handful of contacts within the relevant agencies. She read it in her office with the door closed. When she finished, she sat for a long time without moving. The document described, in the careful language of people who write about operations they cannot fully acknowledge, a man who had spent years building the kind of protection that kept other people alive, and who had stepped away from that work at a precise and irreversible moment, and who had afterward lived with his daughter in a house with a narrow garage and driven a car that looked like nothing. Charlotte set the report on her desk and did not refer to it again, but she did not throw it away either. David Cross had prepared for several outcomes. He had prepared for the investigation to be slow, which investigations usually were. He had prepared for Charlotte to make additional mistakes under pressure, which she usually did. He had prepared for the board's confidence in her leadership to continue its gradual erosion, which had been the trajectory for 3 consecutive quarters. He had not prepared for the particular sequence of events that had unfolded in his company's Target's parking lot on a Saturday afternoon, and he had not prepared for the name Carter Miller to appear anywhere in his operational planning. In the days following the incident, David moved aggressively. He called 3 board members with long relationships and short memories and told them that Charlotte's behavior at the event, the footage was everywhere. He said, and he said it as though the footage were someone else's problem rather than a product of his own planning, demonstrated a fundamental unsuitability for her position. He had a proposal ready, involving a reorganization plan and a new leadership structure, and what the document called transition management. And what he meant was that by the time the dust settled from Charlotte's very public afternoon, he intended to be the person sitting across from the board with the only viable solution. He moved too quickly. The investigators working the device found the transmitter's supply chain within 72 hours. Carter had identified the device type precisely, which significantly reduced the analytical workload, and Mason had recalled 2 members of the technical team who had behaved oddly before the event, and provided names that the investigators cross-referenced with the supply chain documentation and found meaningful. The person from Bennett Apex's own technical staff who had placed the device was taken into custody on a Thursday morning, and under the pressure that federal investigators are permitted to apply, he provided contact information that led to a scheduling record, and the scheduling record contained a phone number, and the phone number led to a service that David Cross believed he had retained under a structure that provided him with adequate distance. It did not provide adequate distance. Carter and Mason had met twice in the week following the incident, the first time to go over the technical documentation from the vehicle's monitoring logs and the second time to review what the investigators had shared with Carter, who was functioning in an informal advisory capacity at the federal team's request. On the night before the board meeting, Carter compiled the relevant data, the transmitter signal logs, the vehicle recordings, a timeline of the device's activation queries cross-referenced with David's known movements, and a communication record his attorneys had not yet had the opportunity to review, and provided it to the lead investigator, who provided it to the board's legal team, who provided a summary to the board members with roughly 12 hours' notice. David arrived at the board meeting in a dark suit and the confidence of someone who has done the arithmetic and found it favorable. He had prepared remarks. He had a slide presentation. He had 3 board members who had agreed, in principle, that a change in leadership direction was worth discussing. He began with the parking lot footage and a brief commentary on leadership accountability, then looked up from his notes to find the room's expression was not what he had anticipated. The lead investigator was in the room. Carter was in the back, in a chair against the wall, with a laptop open in front of him. Carter presented the data without drama. He walked through the transmitter logs and the supply chain and the communication record in the same tone he had used to explain everything else, methodically, without excess, moving from point to point in the order that made the logic most transparent. David's attorney intervened twice and was asked twice to wait. When Carter finished, the room was quiet, and then the lead investigator said several things that were quiet in a different way, and then David's attorney said something to David that none of the recording devices in the room captured clearly, and David Cross was escorted out of the Bennett Apex boardroom by 2 federal agents who had been waiting in the corridor. 6 weeks after the afternoon in the parking lot, the Bennett Apex Foundation announced the establishment of a student safety engineering grant, funded at a level sufficient to support 12 students per year in developing applied safety technology. The program announcement cited Ella Miller's finalist submission as the project that had demonstrated how student-led design thinking could produce work with real-world protective value. Ella's name appeared in the Foundation's press materials next to a photograph of her display table, the one she had arranged on the 14th floor, before everything had become something other than a student competition. She read the announcement at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a moment, and then said it was nice. Carter said it was more than nice. She thought about it and agreed. Charlotte stepped back from the chief executive role on a voluntary basis, citing the company's need for restructured governance and her own intention to engage in what the statement called a period of reflective operational review. The board accepted her proposal without public comment. She remained on the board as a non-executive director, which meant she still mattered, but differently than before. She gave one interview to a business publication that month, brief and carefully worded, and the only direct comment she made about the parking lot afternoon was that she had made decisions that reflected poorly on her and on the organization she represented, and that she intended to make different ones going forward. The interviewer noted that she had not specified what different meant, and Charlotte said that was correct, because she was still working that out. Carter still drove the same car. He picked Ella up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he drove her to her weekend robotics program on Saturdays, and when he pulled into the drop-off lanes and the guest areas and the parking lots of the various places that Ella's life required him to go, no one told him to move the vehicle. A few people who had been in the parking lot that afternoon recognized the car and stepped back slightly as it passed, with the particular deference that people extend to things they have learned are not what they appear. Carter did not acknowledge it. He just parked and waited, and when Ella came out, he drove her home. Ella asked him once more, a few weeks after everything, whether he was ever going to repaint the car. Carter considered it for a moment with the same seriousness he gave to questions that deserved seriousness. He said he did not think so. He said some things worked better when people underestimated them, and that was not a principle he had any interest in giving up. Ella said that was either very smart or very stubborn, and Carter said it was probably both. She laughed at that, and the car rolled forward through the afternoon light, the engine still growling low and unhurried, the rust still showing, and nobody looking twice.
Oh, that crushes him. Oh, wow. We got him. Oh, shit. Easy. Come on. Oh shoot. First try. First try. First fucking try, bro. Give it to me. Stop fucking playing with my name, bro. Let's fucking go. Oh. Oh. Y'all know the vibes.
You might